These are 7 kids that will kill you. Don't be fooled by their innocent looks, because these children are some of the most murderous minors in the world. Today's video was requested by Just the Illuminati, Flower Story, Cookie X, and Jaden Williams. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comment section below. Number 7. Andrew Golden and Mitchell Johnson. March 24th, 1998. Cousins Andrew Golden, 11 years old, and Mitchell Johnson, 13 years old, gunned down 15 people in their middle school in Craighead County, Arkansas, sinking their small city into despair. The notorious schoolyard shooting became known as the Westside Middle School Massacre. It began with one of the 2 boys setting off a false fire alarm in order to lure out students and faculty members out into open ground. They then laid down near a wooded area dressed in camouflage and began the slaughter. A total of 5 people, which comprised of 4 female students and a teacher, were killed. The teacher was 32-year-old Shannon Wright, who threw herself in front of a 6th grader and was shot twice when saving the little girl. She died later on during surgery. But this wasn't enough for the cousins. 10 additional people were injured, 9 students and another teacher. A recorded 27 shots total were fired that day. It was a horrific scene as friends gathered up the bodies of their bloodied classmates while waiting for emergency support. Some were in shock and could not take in what had just occurred in the schoolyard. It's still unsure as to how the murderers gained access to their weapons. Police said Mitchell, who broke up with a girl at school, made threats earlier in the week saying, "Tomorrow you will find out if you live or die." Andrew and Mitchell would be charged with 5 counts of capital murder in juvenile court, and after turning 18 would be moved to a full correctional facility. Number 6. Mary Bell. May 25th, 1968. The day before her 11th birthday, a girl named Mary Bell is convicted of strangling a young boy to death named Martin Brown. It was believed that she committed this homicide alone. Then 2 months later, on July 31st, 1968, Mary Bell strikes again, this time with her friend Norma. The 2 girls targeted a 3-year-old infant named Brian Howe. The resulting interrogation of Mary Bell and Norma completely contradicted each other, as the girls were too young to retell the story. Police reports state that not only did Mary Bell use a pair of scissors to cut off pieces of her victim's hair and part of his genitals, but she also carved an N onto his stomach, then later on went back to turn the N into an M. There was no evidence of foul play from the murder of their first victim, Martin Brown, and thus it was originally ruled as an accident. But in the end, police finally realized the connection between the 2 strangulations. Mary Bell and Norma were charged with 2 counts of manslaughter. In 1980, the court ordered anonymity for Mary Bell and she was released. 23 years later, Mary Bell and her daughter would be awarded anonymity for life. Number 5. Jesse Pomeroy. At 14 years old, Jesse Pomeroy murdered a 4-year-old boy and was eventually arrested for this horrific act. His violent nature began 3 years earlier with the sexual torture of 7 other boys. Thus, he became known as the Boston Boy Fiend. Pomeroy was sentenced to a children's reform school, but was released early for those crimes. But it didn't take long for Jesse to return to his killing spree. He went on to disfigure and execute a 10-year-old girl who was visiting his mother's store. A month later, 4-year-old Horace Mullen was kidnapped by Pomeroy. Jesse started and ended his deadly deed in a swamp outside of town by slashing him savagely with a knife and nearly decapitating his victim. His strange appearance of having a milky white eye along with his previous abhorrent behavior put him on the police's radar. After being shown the body and asked if he had done it, Jesse responded with, "I suppose I did." He later pled guilty to the murder of the 10-year-old girl, as her body was found buried in his mother's cellar. Jesse Pomeroy was condemned and sentenced to death, but his sentence was altered to 40 years of solitary confinement due to a public outcry against dooming children to the death sentence. Number 4. John Venables and Robert Thompson. You name it, they can steal it. John Venables and Robert Thompson, both 10 years old, loved stealing small items at the shopping center. They stole candy, batteries, toys, and whatever else they could get their hands on. One day, they decided to steal a 2-year-old boy named James Bulger, but once they had him, they didn't know what to do with him. That's when things took a turn for the worst. John and Robert ended up murdering the little boy, who was to be taken on a long, aimless walk while being cruelly tortured along the way. The infant was senselessly beaten beaten to death by his 10-year-old captors, who then abandoned him on the railroad tracks once the deed was done. Numerous images were found in a video feed of little James in the hands of his killers, which confirmed to his parents that they would never see their baby alive again. Number 3. Willie Bosket. March 19, 1978. 15-year-old Willie Bosket shoots and kills Noel Perez on the New York subway during an attempt to take his money and watch. 8 days later, he shot another man in another subway robbery attempt. Willie was tried and ultimately convicted of the murders. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, the maximum length for a minor to stay in New York City's correctional facilities. But although his crimes were committed while he was still a minor, the convicted murderer's actions led to a change in New York state law. New York state legislature soon passed a new law called the Juvenile Offender Act of 1978 due to the short length of Bosket's sentence, which caused a public outcry. The newly implemented Juvenile Offender Act would now bring juveniles as young as 13 years old to adult court for criminal offenses such as murder, where they would be given the same amount of penalties as adults. New York was the first state to endorse a law of this nature, with many other state legislatures soon following suit. Bosket had subsequently been convicted of a number of other felonies following his release, for which he received several life sentences. Bosket is presently serving his sentence in solitary confinement in New York State's prison system. Number 2. Joshua Phillips. 1998. 14-year-old Joshua Phillips clubs and stabs his 8-year-old playmate named Maddie to death, then hides her body underneath his bed. Despite having no history of violence, he was charged as an adult for the murder. Over the next 7 days, thousands of volunteers searched frantically for the little girl. Josh's family was also part of the search, not knowing that the victim's body remained in their house. On the morning of the 7th day, Josh Phillips' mother noticed some water on the floor at the end of her son's waterbed. She initially thought this leaking water was the cause of the strange smell in her son's room, but after pulling apart the bed to check underneath it, she saw Maddie's foot. She hurriedly called up the police department. As it turns out, Maddie was Joshua's tomboy neighbor who went out to play with him and never came back. Joshua claimed that he had accidentally hit Maddie in the eye with his baseball bat, causing her to scream. In his panic, Joshua dragged her to his home, where he hit her again, then stabbed her 11 times. The jury was not persuaded by his testimony. Joshua was unanimously charged with first-degree murder. 4 days after his arrest, Maddie was buried. His mother is still appealing his conviction to this day based on the fact that he was given an adult penalty for his crime. Number 1. Edmund Kemper. 1964. 15-year-old Edmund Kemper gets into a heated argument with his grandmother in the kitchen of their home and ends up shooting her to death. His grandfather then returned home shortly afterwards. It was at this point that Kemper went outside, shot him by his car, then hid the body. According to reports, Kemper had no regrets about what he did, explaining that he hated his grandparents and was tired of them telling him to do things around the house, which he deeply despised. While detained in the California Youth Authority's juvenile hall, he was put through a series of rigorous tests that were administered by a psychiatrist. Results showed that Kemper was, in fact, a paranoid psychotic. He was quickly sent to Atascadero State Hospital for treatment. There he worked hard to make doctors believe he had recovered and learned other perspectives on his former crimes. Kemper worked in the psychology lab to help administer the tests to others and in the process learned about other deviant offenders. 5 years later, he was released and remained under the supervision of the Youth Authority. The Youth Authority ignored Kemper's doctor's orders of not returning him to his mother's care. Thus, he continued his sadistic ways. He murdered, dismembered, and disposed parts of 8 women by picking up hitchhikers over the course of 5 years. Once murdered, he'd bring the bodies back to his apartment to remove their heads and hands. It was also reported that Kemper would engage in sexual activity with the corpses. Kemper pleaded insanity in court, with the same doctors agreeing to the decision. A panel of psychiatrists even judged Kemper as a person who was not a threat to society, despite carrying the body parts of his victims around with him. In the end, Kemper received 8 concurrent life sentences and is currently serving his time at Vacaville's California Medical Facility. Find out more about child murderers today at theywillkillyou.com by clicking on the link in the top right corner of your screen.